Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and whatever mixtures or alternatives exist thereof, welcome to the Integral Stage. This is a special sub-series near and dear to our hearts called Who's Afraid of Integral Postmetaphysics? You probably know that Integral Stage is a kind of independent media, which a couple decades ago we thought was going to save us from centralized state and corporate control of information. But now everyone has a megaphone, and it's a confusion of tongues and a fragmentation of reality and over-optimization of information sources that might be contributing to an unprecedented centralization of control. So in a way, independent media turned out to be part of the problem. And folks, nobody's a bigger part of the problem than me, Layman Pascal. And that makes me sad. But you know what makes me happy? Every time our guest today is here. Daniela joins me from the other side of the world, where both she and her recently deceased teacher, Andrew Cohen, have been curious interlocutors about and with leading edge philosophy, social theory, spiritual developmental models. And the reason I mention her teacher is because I love this old, beautiful tradition of referencing and contextualizing higher and deeper things through your existential mentor or favorite consciousness mutant and heart friend. So we're happy to have her back on the show. Jai Guru, and welcome, Daniela.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I was really looking forward to this. And you know what? I was just thinking, shouldn't it actually be the title, Who is Afraid of Metaphysics? And not Who is Afraid of Post-Metaphysics? So are there more people afraid of post-metaphysics, or are there more people afraid of metaphysics?
Well, I think this is a really good question, and it depends which cultural circles you're traveling in. I think most people are very comfortable embedded in some form of metaphysics. A lot of thinkers over the last couple hundred years have been very concerned about metaphysics and have developed some fears and phobias about that. And then there have been people trying to counterbalance that by bringing back in a lot of the things that were associated with the old metaphysics. And some of those people we might half jokingly say are afraid of integral post metaphysics, but really I think it's just because it seems like a nebulous concept. Like a lot of people read Ken Wilbur and they go, okay, right, development, different zones, inside and outside, we get that. And then you go post metaphysics, and they go, it's too abstract.
No, that's too far. That's too abstract. Yeah. No, it's true. I was listening again to your first conversation with Alexander Love, and the distinctions you made between the four different post-metaphysic definitions. You remember that? And I was kind of contemplating if what I feel drawn to fits in any of those, and I wasn't sure. So that's probably something we could explore together too.
Yeah.
If you give me a little bit a better sense what your fourth, I mean, I'm sure it's not the first three, but then I was listening to your definition of your fourth post-metaphysical definition thingles, and would like to understand it a little better to kind of see where I can connect, or I have a sense there could be a fifth one.
Well, I was kind of going the other way. I was trying to compress mine this morning down to like, can I get it down to 3?
Oh, really? Oh, that's
let me.
cool.
I'll run through the way I've been thinking about it this morning, and then you feel out where you fit. But also, I'd love to hear from you, like what you think of when you think of that word, what it means to you. So for me, there's a kind of, let's say 3. Right? There's a very simple post metaphysics, which is just pragmatism. Right? You can do all kinds of practices without worrying about what's true about the universe. You don't have to believe something for it to be able to affect you. And maybe at this point in history, it's more useful for people to think about how processes change us rather than do we agree about the universe or not. So that's pragmatic post-metaphysics. And then there's a kind of developmental post-metaphysics where every new layer of complexity and nuance reassesses the previous metaphysics. It's post those old metaphysics. So the modernists say, we agree about a lot of things with the traditionalists, but we don't agree that there's an actual a special god entity of some kind, we're going to say that was a misinterpretation in their metaphysics. Yeah. And every layer will take some of the old metaphysics away or change it. And then there's this ontological post-metaphysics, which is the thing I'm most excited about, where almost like the move that the word post represents, that is the basis of the metaphysics. It's like, so you make a metaphysics out of post-metaphysics, out of the incompleteness and the in-between and the uncertainty and all the critiques that the modern and postmodern mind have been leveling at each other and traditional metaphysics. You say, okay, that's not a criticism. You're actually highlighting the building blocks of a new way to say this. That's the part I'm most excited about.
You see, and I think I would go, if I had to define my understanding of post-metaphysics, I would go one step further. And you might challenge me and say, yeah, that's kind of the first one. That's what we had before. But for me, what is very important, that we are not positioning metaphysics just as a belief system. Like metaphysics, in my experience, is never just a belief, but it's at its best an experience of something where you are convinced that this is something real. I don't even want to go as far as calling it an absolute, even though one could probably, but let's say it's an experience of something real that is very different than our normal daily perception of life, or our normal small self personal perception of life. Or in other words, I connected very strongly to what most traditions would call awakening or enlightenment, or something is opening up in you and you find yourself in a different state of being. And that not only in being, but actually in becoming, in living in this manifest world. And once you experience that, you know that this is important, and this gives you a new foundation from where you want to live your life. And then this kind of metaphysic experience, or this kind of metaphysics, then for me is the starting point to do all the things that you defined in your fourth definition of the post-metaphysics, like not fixing things down, being very flexible in what is true and what is not, what is reality, what is not reality, what emerges, what hides, and then all the paradoxes that arise from. I also feel that from that place there is much more space for paradoxes, for holding very different things and perception as one, that don't have to contradict each other. A very simple one that I'm very fascinated by is, to make it a little more concrete, is the whole topic of autonomy and communion, of sovereignty and collective endeavor, collective consciousness. That's one of these paradoxes where I feel like this kind of metaphysics make it possible to hold those as one thing, not collapsing it into each other, but as something that is real in its contradiction. And there are many more of this kind of paradoxes, and the uncertainties and the surprises that are possible from that starting point of a different consciousness, of an awakened mind, an awakened being.
That crosses many of those different types that I mentioned, and I agree. I mean, in the phenomenology of the experiences that people can have, some are more profound, more transformative. You have these encounters with reality somehow, and in a way, it's independent of your belief. You could say, I know what happened and I believe in it. You could say, I don't know what that was. Maybe it didn't even happen, but I observe that my behavior is now different. And I can describe that in a number of different languages through a number of different worldview lenses, right? I could describe that in a traditional way or a modern way or a postmodern way. And they're all pretty good. Each of them has some advantages. And as those layers get more sophisticated, they give us some ways of thinking that allow us to make more sense out of the paradoxes. We start to see that it's almost like the thing they were saying was wrong with metaphysics was that it didn't have enough paradox built into it. So they keep finding space where there used to be an assertion. And it gets to a point where you say, oh, I see. It's not just a complaint that the metaphysical thing isn't really real. It's an insistence that space is built into it somehow. And so you go, okay, there's something about not quite, something about relationships that are not fully separate or not fully unified, can't be reduced, can't be separated. And these sorts of paradox-like structures are needed to make sense in a postmodern way, right? To say a new kind of metaphysics. And I think this is what all the meta theorists are doing, right? When I look at meta theories, I see them as collections of what I call meta themes, right? So like Wilbur has quadrants and lines. He's found some pieces of sense making and he's arranged them. And someone else could find a few different ones or make a different arrangement. But each of these pieces is like a Mobius strip shape, right? There's two dimensions that aren't fully paradoxical. They don't cancel each other, but they can't be separated and they can't be reduced. And I see something like that in all of our sciences as well. I don't know if I talked about this with Alexander or not, but Heisenberg's uncertainty principle stands out to me a lot, which is to say, below a certain level, you can't distinguish between position and momentum, right? We used to say they're just two pieces of information, but they're actually connected. You can't reduce one to the other. You can't get rid of one, but you can't separate them either. And that shape of is it or isn't it, or is it or that thing, I think that's kind of the building block of a new metaphysics that has the power of post metaphysics, but is constructive.
No, I agree. And the way you describe it, I would then probably, but I mean, the words are very difficult to find here. I wanted to say, I would say that the metaphysics is holding all of what you are describing, like in a container. And what comes to mind for me, and from the lineage I come from, that's for me true non-duality. Like when we can, as imperfect as this is possible, hold a non-dual position to life, or in life, or how we live our lives, then everything else is appearing inside that non-duality. Because what I find interesting, and I have thought a lot about that, so many people that talk about non-duality, you feel like non-duality is something flat that has no movement. It's like this, just a flat pancake of non-duality. Everything is the same. But the realization of non-duality is so different because it's actually the non-duality of everything that is happening. And then there is also in that space, there is no such thing as a belief in anything, because the belief needs somebody to believe in something. Yeah. But a non-dual approach holds the whole process of us moving towards the future as one single thing that is unfolding, with all its contradiction, with all its challenges, with all its ups and downs. And we are never capable of kind of penetrating it all. And therefore we need these meta maps, and that never really can describe the territory fully. But I feel like the experience, the awakening experience, comes the closest to the territory. And I'm not saying it's the absolute. I don't think anybody in a human form can have this full blown experience, but I feel like it comes the closest to realize reality in its unfolding in every single moment, and then start to be able to respond to that reality through our lives. It's a constant realize and respond. Andrew called it realize and respond. You want to see, you want to respond, you want to see, you want to respond, but always from the present moment and from what is here and now.
Yeah, I frequently make a distinction between sort of causal mysticism and non-dual mysticism. And causal always strikes me as, like you were saying, flat, kind of homogeneous quality, like it's the differences aren't really real, really only the one thing is real, or only the emptiness is real, and it's generic, it's the same everywhere. Whereas the
Yeah.
language around non-duality has traditionally been more paradoxical. It's a yes and a no.
Yeah.
And so there's different ways to unfold that, right? We could say there's the kind of enlightened condition, but then there's the unfolding changing thing, and somehow they're not different, but they are a little different, and this sort of back and forth way of speaking becomes necessary. And in the experience of it, the miraculous flavor that makes it distinct from states of causal awakening is that peculiarity, which is fascinating. It's amazing, this peculiarity, but you see it everywhere. You see it in everything. You see it in every explanation, every time you try to check yourself. Even objects have that same quality, and it fits perfectly and can't be tied down. And I think we're at the beginning of a new movement in trying to language that. There have been movements in the past, and we're trying to take as many of those seriously as possible. But I think we're also starting to see from science and from philosophy some things that these different fields have in common in terms of trying to say more of the richness of what this thing is. And one of the really important parts is the sense that boundaries are also the unboundaried condition, is one of the paradoxical elements, right? So and it's a little bit of an intellectual indulgence, some of the ways I communicate. But if I want to say something like, it's not the case that there's knowledge and then we know there's this mystery beyond knowledge, it's the case that we can't even know that or not. Right. So I'm drawing attention away from the picture to the boundary of knowing. We can't even know if we can't know it or not. But the boundary is also the unboundaried condition. They're not separate. The divider is the connector as well.
Yeah, or the way I would probably express it is that, no, I wanted to comment first on something that you said. You said something like when you kind of have this awakened condition and then still there is movement. My sense is that it's very valuable to introduce a new kind of awakening, the awakening to this movement as a distinct awakening that is different than the awakening to being, and the awakening that many people can relate to in meditation, where everything falls away and the mind falls away and you just think into being and the silence and stillness of infinite nothingness. And I think it's very valuable to introduce a different kind of awakening that happens in becoming. It's an awakening to that movement that you so beautifully described, to that fluctuation and to that pushing towards the edges of the knowing, and to see that as much as an awakening that we can incorporate, that we can live, and then push against these boundaries as awakened to the becoming, to the movement, to the manifest world, but from that meta or post-metaphysical position of a new awakening that is not static, that is actually dynamic and is animated by, I don't know what, but it feels animated. It seems to be animated. Looking how the universe is unfolding, there seems to be an animation that we can become consciously part of. And that's what I would call the awakening to becoming, as a distinct second kind of awakening.
I think it's very useful to try to make that distinction. My hunch is that that becoming is sort of built into the being type realizations, in the same way that in science we've looked and went, oh, we thought this was solid matter and that it was just sitting there. But when you look really closely, there was actually a dynamism and a strangeness inside it, right? That even like there's realizations of spaciousness, but when we look at space, it turns out it's a seething quantum vacuum of virtual particles changing and transforming. And so I think
there is no matter anywhere.
If there was some way to zoom in on the just consciousness or the just being types of experiences, if you could look inside it, you would probably see that becoming is in there doing something that just happens to look like being under those particular circumstances.
I understand what you're saying, and that might or might not be true. And obviously everything, I mean, in this philosophy, everything came from being. Being is the kind of the source, and then something explodes out of it. But for our discussion, I find it valuable to make the distinction, because I know from experience that when you can encourage people to see that they can awaken to something that is beyond their mind, but not in silence and not in sitting still and not in meditation, but in action, that catalyzes a kind of transformation in people that is very different than the awakening to being. Ramana Maharshi and Sri Aurobindo had two very different kind of awakenings. And I recently looked into some articles that both of them wrote about the other one, and they were not pleased with the other philosophies, I can tell you that much. But they were both acknowledged awakened masters. And I do think it would be very valuable to promote the idea that there is an awakening possible that is not in stillness. And in the end, I agree. Then we go back to non-duality. And when we think non-dual or feel non-dual, then anyway, being and becoming is the same thing. I don't disagree with you. I just wonder if for development purposes, it can be valuable to make it a point and encourage people to see, oh, there is an other kind of awakening that actually could be more transformational or as transformational as the one that I was familiar with.
Yeah, John Vervaeke makes this distinction between languages of explaining and languages of training, right? And I often think about it like I used to teach meditation, and it's very useful to say a word like emptiness when you're in training mode. When you're in explaining mode, you go, well, is it even possible to think the concept of emptiness? You know, it might not even be a real idea, right? But that's not terribly useful with people all the time. So on the one hand, I have this philosophical side of me that wants to think, culturally we have to introduce more awareness of becoming. I think transformation, I think time, I think change and evolution. This is something that individuals and cultures are taking more seriously, and it has to be at the heart of the way we communicate with each other going forward at this time in history. But then as a philosopher, I go, I can't actually separate the thought of being and the thought of becoming, because like being, it's
Yeah,
a verb, but on the other hand, becoming has to be in order to be becoming. They're not thinkable as, like that kind of a thing. And I think
totally.
that's fascinating. And if you have a sense of what this other kind of experience is, then you find that experience even in the conceptual element of it. You look into
Mhm.
like that tension, you go, oh, there it is. And you're delighted, and it reawakens this experience for you. But that's only true if you have a very good philosophical mind and also are already versed in this kind of experience. So
Yeah, yeah.
for cultural outreach and for helping people, I think you're right that it is important to try to identify or name or encourage this other kind of enlightenment, to make people aware that it's a possibility and that they can move toward it more directly.
Exactly, and especially because uh, I feel like many people who are even meditators and acknowledge enlightenment or awakening in meditation or being awakening, uh, then get up from the meditation cushion and focus on self-development, ego development, self-development, stage development, or however we want to call it. And then the becoming becomes psychologically uh, captured, in the sense of that then transformation and development is purely psychological. And that's why I feel so strongly that I want to make a point that in that movement, in that developmental line, there is also awakening possible, and it changes a lot. And I'm not saying personal development is not important. I'm not saying that at all. But I want to encourage people to consider something else possible too, and not leave that on the meditation cushion and then go into their personal self-development cycles, and missing the point that they actually could get out from the meditation cushion and live an awakened life in becoming, and being animated by that becoming awakening, which is a totally different experience of life. And it takes you out of this hyper personal, hyper individualistic state so many people today are in, and it expands the view on your own life and on life itself and on the universe and everything.
I'm being reminded of some of Adida's work. Right, in his autobiography, there was an interesting chapter where he tries to consider what he's been going through in connection with the writings of Ramana Maharshi. And he says, oh, he calls it the regenerated and the unregenerated version of the divine nectar current, right? And he's using the unregenerated version, where you've gotten away into this space, but there's another one where the space comes back and does things. And then
Yeah.
for all his qualities and faults, tried to set up a stage development system that you inhabit from this other condition already. And I think something like that needs to be done in a lot of different and new and interesting ways, because even in the way Integral tends to frame this, it divides up these zones, which is good so that we can remember to include them and we don't think one takes care of the other. But there has to be more of a bridge between state experiences and developmental experiences. If there isn't, if they seem like they stay in their own zones too much, then we get this result that you mentioned, which is like the psychological capture of the developmental process, rather than having that process extend from the basic embodied insight and flavor that you get in these particular states.
Yeah. But I mean, that also brings us to the Wilbur comes lattice that I feel like is so undervalued by so many people, or understood, because that's Wilbur comes lattice points exactly to what you are pointing to, that if we don't see the awakening as a different axis of development from stage development or personality development, then something is missing. And too many people still feel like the development path goes up and then towards enlightenment. instead of seeing how much awakening is possible on almost every level. And on the integral level, we then can start to talk about real post-metaphysics. When awakening hits integral, then it all comes beautifully together, no?
Absolutely. I think the Wilbur's willingness to think in terms of the lattice was one of his strongest, let's say, post-metaphysical moves. It really opens this system up and makes it different than other transpersonal developmental systems of various kinds. Because obviously those, to some degree, babies are having all of those states in their own way, right? Maybe the animals are having all those states in their own way. So then we start to look at how those states interact with different levels of sophistication. And then there's these really fine-grained questions like, okay, what does non-duality really look like when you get to postmodernism? Because you have to be good at that to get it to an integral level. And I think what a lot of people do is they start to go into the postmodern and they go, whoa, I don't know about this. I'm going to just take traditional and scientific and hold them both together and feel like I've got it, because I don't know how to cross the postmodern on its own terms. So I think one of the things we need to do is figure out what embodied non-duality looks like, how it shows up for people operating at the pluralistic band. And then that gives us a lot of clues about what authentic post-pluralistic looks like.
That's interesting. And do you have a sense how it could look like, should look like, might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the ways of speaking that I've been using when it comes to philosophy are around that it's somehow like difference and limitation and gap are tend to be the way that the postmoderns see things. Intercontextual space. Now this is where it gets tricky. Wilbur was very clear on, Derrida and people who are looking at intercontextual sources and how meaning fractures. That's not the same as non-duality. You're like, yes, but it doesn't mean it can't be. It just means that most of the people doing that aren't really engaging their body or their consciousness or their heart when they examine those things. Because I think the difference between the contexts that determine how we perceive reality and even perceive our own experience, that parallax is something that the postmodernists detect, but they don't inhabit it deeply enough for it to be a transformative experience. And so it's not good enough for integral to say just, well, that's not the full non-dual experience. We have to say, here's how you would bring that alive to have full non-dual experience with that kind of thinking. And then from there, we can let it unfold to a richer thing beyond that, if we can accept that. So there's this is one of the things. Andrew and I had a few correspondence exchanges around whether the absolute should be in quotation marks.
Yeah.
Right. And I think for most people, the quotation marks are, you draw back. You're not fully engaged because you put it in quotation marks. But I think there is this possibility that the quotation marks are an even richer form of engagement if we allow our hearts to enter that not quiteness and find in the not quiteness another flavor of the revelation of the non-dual.
Yeah. I remember that discussion. And I mean, Andrew was a teacher, and I can find it in myself, obviously, as a long-time student who did believe in absolutes. We have to be very clear about that. And I still find it interesting to think about absolute reality as kind of the absolute ground, or the absolute motivation, or the absolute force that brings it all forward. But I can see that one can have a totally different view on that, and be much more ambiguous with everything. And yeah, I don't mind. Let's put it like this, because I feel like, it makes sense, because even if we call it the absolute, we never can grasp the absolute anyway. So then we can also go the route of making it ambiguous, or have the quotation marks. But in the end, it's the leaning into wanting to become more clear, or more see more of reality and not less. Whatever we do with this reality, however we call it, that the leaning is towards more understanding and more clarity. And even if the clarity is that, oh, this is another paradox, or this is another ambiguity, but in the end, we always want to see more. That seems to be the movement moving forward.
One of the ways I think about second tier approaches is that their function is to, in many respects, to help clarify what is valid about green, pluralistic, and postmodern approaches, right? So when we look at the politics of the world, we go, yeah, progressive values are something we need, but a lot of the way they're doing it is a problem. So the next level should be able to go say, yeah, you guys are basically doing the right thing, but here's where you're not really doing it, or here's where you're making a mistake in terms of what you're trying to succeed. And I think like the meta modern virtue of sincere irony is like that, right? We go, so it's the capacity for ironic and skeptical and deconstructive mental awareness, but it's coupled with a physiological and affective complete commitment. You're fully engaged, right? Your life is your life. It's a sincere thing, right? And so then you want to be able to look back at the other people who have this more complicated way of seeing things, critical and multiplistic, and say, yeah, that's right. But you have to also reach out. You have to really embody it. You have to really be the being who inhabits this world of becoming and multiple frames that you're seeing. And that if we can get that, if we can help them get that, then there's a beautiful possibility of bringing spirit into the world at that level without having to drop back to a lower level to get it. But it's a strange one. It requires a lot from us. When I think of, yeah, go ahead.
And I wonder, what does it mean to make them see that, or make them change, or make them learn to not be so absolutistic? Because that's often the problem in all of this polarization, that everybody, left and right and everywhere, is very absolutistic in their views, no? And what you are advocating is that we find a way where this all can be held seriously, but more lightly, and with more flexibility and more curiosity, what is really true and what does really work, and how do we really want to live our life. But I'm not clear what the pathway is to teach that, to train people to be able to do that.
I think it requires several complementary things to happen at the same time, right? First of all, you have to have had enough of the experience and the way of thinking to be able to see how it goes together so that you can speak to that with people. And also enough charity of heart and understanding that when they talk about what they're seeing, you go, yes, you're right. Not you've made a mistake. You don't really, yeah, you're seeing it. What I'd like you to do is go even deeper into that. Do more of that thing you're talking about. And I've done that. And doesn't it look happy? And right, make an ease and a welcome and a recognition so that there's a bridge. And probably also there's neurophysiological things that help with that, right? Because we're saying even a person who says there's no absolutes, and they're trying to say that there's this complex relational universe, and they're very stiff and absolutistic about it. You go, you're right, but it's got to be smoother. It should flow between those things. And maybe your body isn't flowing. Maybe your brain isn't flowing enough to find the smooth parts. You're just finding edges that are hard. So I think there's a training. The human being has to be ready to be able to find its way into these spaces, and some of that's a looseness, some of that's a heart, and some of that's being recognized as saying something valid.
Yeah, and some of that is probably bringing us back to the awakening. Some of that is having the consistent experiences of being able to get out of your mind, to then re-embrace the mind, to go into all these differentiations and making distinctions and go deeper, but from a wider space in yourself. And that's again why I feel so strongly the awakening dimension needs promotion, needs advertisement.
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, it's kind of there in the new psychedelic movement, where you can find these kind of mind altering experiences. But I miss it in normal developmental circles, like this full embrace of, oh, there is a state that I can achieve that is beyond mind, where I go to a place that is not familiar, where I'm not in control, where I have to let go of my mind. And that's where the magic happens. And that's not a superstition. It's a place that you can explore yourself.
I think that that invitation quality is important. I'm thinking about, something about the relationship between the state and the structure is necessary in order to chart new pathways, right? So, and there's two different ways, at least, that relationship can occur. One way is being able to draw on your experience of the state and be curious about whether that state is showing up in different structures. And then the other way is the Zen koan way, where what you're given is a very strange little structure. And if you keep wrestling with the structure, and the structure usually does something like, you can't tell the difference between sameness and difference, or it's some kind of paradox. And then when you break through into the state, you're like, oh, that's interesting. That state was in that kind of a structure. So somehow those things go, so from two sides, you start to figure out, oh, it goes together.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, like the potential to encourage people to believe that they are not mind dependent, that their mind is a tool and not what they are, is for me, this is still one of the most exciting things in our spiritual and personal development, like to crack the boundaries of the human mind, and then find yourself in a place that is so much bigger, and then reintegrate the mind as a tool to help you to navigate, but from a totally different perspective and a totally different experiential starting point. It's almost like for me, the awakening is kind of awakening first and then everything else. That's very radical. I'm aware of that, and I'm not saying that's the only pathway. I just have seen so many people change so massively when they actually could let go into this space, and then a whole new world opens up.
Yeah, I think in most cases that's essential. And part of the post-metaphysical argument is there's lots of different ways to say that. Like the traditional way has been to sort of postulate that we know for sure that there's a metaphysical something that's greater than the mind. And maybe that thing's even eternal and everywhere, or it's the consciousness of the whole reality or something like that. And that's a very lovely way to speak about it, but we can't know that for sure.
We don't know exactly.
So you can sometimes say to people, like, it could be talked about as, here's your conscious thinking mind, but also most of you is unconscious. And what happens if your consciousness fuses with your unconscious? Or let's imagine if you think you're just your brain, okay, that's fine. But there's also a physical electrical field that's doing a lot of the organizing and intelligence work around your body. And that's larger than this, it's larger than your flesh, right? So there's these, right? None of these ways have to be the true way. But I don't think we necessarily lose anything if we shift the different languages. And I think so, like
I
there's
agree.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree that the language is not the problem. But what I miss in what you just described, I just felt what I miss is this cracking the shell of one's individuality, of the me as a small self. And even if you say you're unconscious, your electricity field, that's still me, small me. And there is a power in allowing yourself to become bigger, at least in your experience. I'm not even saying I know how absolute reality looks like, but the experience of coming out of your shell of the small self's limitations into something that definitely feels much bigger and much more connected to everything else. And then we end up with non-duality again, like when you then land in a non-dual experience, then that changes your relationship to life. And I find it very important to crack this highly individuated, self-focused life that most people live for their own sake. Like so many people are suffering because they are so focused on their own pain and suffering and trauma and everything. If they can crack that and see that there is so much more, it's so enlightening.
I got this image of these two sides, but also there's a joiner between them. So on the one side, there's the language of explaining, like what is going on, right? Sometimes people are interested in that, sometimes they aren't. From my kind of post metaphysical approach, I would say you need at least two different explanations, right? So that there's at least this kind of thing going on. And a lot of what we might say are the old metaphysical way to talk about it is whoever's teaching you just says, here's the one explanation. And if you present an opposite, they go, no, you don't really get it. That's not the real thing. You go, well, okay, there should be at least two so that we can say, we don't know, but they both kind of look the same from a certain angle, don't they? And that's on the explaining side. On the training side, on the phenomenology side, you have to have the experience you were just talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to be cracked open or melted beyond, or so it has to actually exceed the enclosure of your self-definition. And then sort of between those two sides is whatever idea, whatever explanation helps you to do that, right? So for some person, their neurological unconscious or their electrical field or the intelligence of the planet or whatever, that might be enough. For someone else, when they think those thoughts, they go, that's not enough. It still feels like it's me. I need a bigger or a different way to think about it so that I can get in touch with the experience of actually opening.
Yeah. So you believe that you can get there with explanations, or with
I believe sometimes explanations are helpful for people's practice to orient them. But I also think that, well, in most cases, you have to have the experience in order to find the experience in the explanation. Right?
Yeah. Otherwise, it stays
prajna is
theoretical.
samadhi, right? So, like, there's a way of advanced thinking that is somehow the same as the state experience, but you have to have both to see where they overlap with each other.
Yeah. And then there is this whole question of how much do people actually want to get there, no? like in our teaching, this is very essential. Like this sense of do you really want to be free more than anything else? And what does that mean to want to be free, want to get to that experience more than anything else? And how much how much are most people held back by their own psyche of actually then surrendering? This is an old metaphysical word, surrendering to something higher, to something bigger, to more space, to and that's a big question when we talk about post metaphysics, no? Because in these highly individuated situations, it feels like this is much more difficult for people to want to go beyond the contract itself. Or is that not your experience?
Several things come up for me. So I'll try to run through them. One is people can be invited in within themselves or by other people. Sometimes if however they see the world is being validated, then that opens up their ability to want to pass through a barrier, right? So if someone says, if you say to someone, yeah, there's no absolutes, and they're like, well, I need absolutes or I can't send my energy in this direction. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, if someone else says, if you're going to talk about absolutes, I'm sorry, I'd like to, but I can't send my energy there. Yeah. So there have to be ways to say both.
Yeah.
That's one. I think the drive, the urgency, the strength of the longing and the prioritization is important. But where that's something psychological and where that's the amount of energy in the unit, in the organism, is uncertain. So I spend a lot of time in the Gurdjieffian model. And what they talk a lot is not so much what you consciously value and prioritize. For them, it's whether you've been doing work to build up the energy resources in yourself that can actually move you in that direction, regardless of what you're thinking about it. And then another element that comes up for me is the difference between, and sometimes the similarity between, what we value and how clear we are about our values. So there's this, I don't know if you know the release method, came from Lester Levinson in the United States. It's a very interesting thing. You let go of aspects of your experience and your energetic commitment by asking yourself these questions. And they're all around letting go. Right? But what's important is the authenticity of the response, not the answer. So you're like, am I willing to let this go? The answer no is a better answer if it's more true. You're more likely to be able to let go of it because of the sharpness of the authenticity of your answer. So do you really want to break through? If I don't really want to break through and I say no, am I closer than if I try to make myself say yes?
That's interesting. So the theory is no is better because it's more true to what is happening?
If it's more true, yeah. So I mean, I think this is what we don't know. It's worth thinking about is whether it's what we prioritize in our values or whether it's how clear we are about our values.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I mean, that's an area where I really valued having a guru. In this relationship between a student and the guru, all these kind of things get revealed very quickly and very thoroughly, because so many things we actually don't know, at least not consciously, if we are willing to let it go or not, or we are not aware that we haven't let go of this, that, or the other thing. And it's very interesting, this letting go steps, when you kind of watch yourself. There are things that are easy to be let go, and then you are proud that you let go of that, but you miss the things that are very small but much more important, and then the guru has to point there again and again and again. And that's where I find the guru-student relationship still so valuable, or any teacher-student relationship, or even a coach-mentee relationship could do the same. I think it's mainly about a trusted relationship between two people that trust each other, and therefore there is a level of honesty and clarity possible that is not possible in any other relationship.
Honesty and clarity, and enough intimacy so that things get provoked, that they get brought up,
yes,
to be inspected.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Even though I sometimes think that happens very quickly. But yeah, that was at least my experience, and living with Andrew, somebody like him is kind of getting all the worst parts of you out of you very quickly and expose it. It's an interesting process. But that's another interesting question for our post-metaphysical conversation, no? What's happening with mentors or gurus or teachers, or what's happening with a hierarchy of realization, of depths, of access to a little more clarity, a little more depth and understanding.
Yeah, how do we, if there's something like a membrane or like a filter, and that filter consists of a lot of very nuanced new ways of thinking and valuing and holding society and looking at things. To what degree can the old forms pass through that or not? And many attempts have been made to just pass through, and they've kind of gone astray. So where does it actually pass through without losing all of its characteristics entirely? I think very much about two sorts of things as important. And one is, actually, Andrew and I might have talked about this one time, a topological model, which is different than vertical or flat, right? So rather than let's gather, and in the gathering, one person is all the way up and they say all their experience, or let's gather and nobody's above anybody else. You go, actually, if we're going to gather, if it's a real field, then everybody's at a different altitude. And you might not even, it might not even be best for you to talk to the person who's the highest on this particular thing, right?
True, very true.
It might be better for you to talk to a person who's just a little bit higher than you, right? Yeah. So there's this landscape model that I think we can use to split the difference between vertical authority and egalitarian flatness. So I think that's one sort of approach. But I think the other side is the demeanor of mentors has to change, right? Or there's it's like we talk about the masculinity crisis or these things, like how do you get a lot of the old good classical qualities, but in a form that's new and adequate and has enough integrity and has enough permeability to let other people in and adapt to the world we exist in. So I think people have to be invited to the role playing, I think, of the hierarchical relationship, because this is actually a very interesting piece. As much as we might look at certain kinds of teaching scenarios, and a lot of people find it problematic, those same people don't necessarily find it problematic to go to a BDSM club and have dominance and submission games. Yeah, and so there's something about that context. And you go, there's some rules, and there's a conscious, intentional invitation, and this isn't everything, but we're going to play this right now, because this kind of play, if you get invested in it, can have these effects if you're drawn to it. So I think that kind of invitation is useful. But a lot of it's going to come down to the personality type, the emotional qualities of the individuals who are being the mentors, as to whether they need it to be very solid, or whether they can't hold the differences, or whether they can kind of play between both. And if we had a lot of people who could play between both, I think very quickly we'd get a new kind of mentorship culture that would have a lot of the old virtues still.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like also your first scenario, the topographical thing, because that's something that we cultivated in our Sangha, even with Andrew, because it was never just Andrew plus and then to each and every student, but it was always about the Sangha developing what we call a natural hierarchy, and that's what you just described. And if everybody gets sensitive where the natural hierarchy is, where you can look up and learn from, and then the peer level that is a very specific different kind of learning and supporting each other. Peer interaction, they have a very special quality, and then looking down, if we speak of down and up, and help other people to grow. And if you have a system where everybody is sensitive enough to recognize natural hierarchy, I think it's the most beautiful thing that you can build. The tricky thing is that you always have people in there that don't recognize the hierarchy, either that they see themselves higher or lower than they are, or they don't want to take responsibility, or it only works when it works, when everybody is sensitive enough to what is actually happening. And that's then the big challenge.
It's a lot of, and I think this is one of the things that healthy postmodern culture has shown us, a lot of problems with power, a lot of problems with emotional reactivity that pretends to have status, a lot of difficulty, and we see it in every aspect of life. I think one of the things that the new sensitivity has revealed is that a lot of home lives, a lot of churches, a lot of political situations, a lot of child raising situations have all these difficulties, and they create a certain kind of society which can do some functions but leaves a lot of other things problematically uninspected. So how do we bring in a bunch of that understanding without losing any of the characteristics? It's a really interesting one. And if those balances were more completely realized in the rest of society, then you would get more balanced people showing up in spiritual training and existential mentorship scenarios. Right? Yeah. If you had a really nice, healthy childhood and you were sensitive to differences in maturation with you and your parents and your siblings, and nobody was getting oppressed, but there were real variations to learn, then great, you could just go right into this. The problem is we don't have that training in society, and to some degree, these special learning things that we set up developmentally are like remedial education, right? We're like, you didn't get the appropriate play in your own house or your own school or your own neighborhood. So when you show up, you don't have the skills. So in addition to trying to do what we're doing in our spiritual enclave, we also have to provide remedial education about how to learn these things. And that makes it more problematic, but also very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And to add to that, it's also crucial to be trained to get out of your super personal sphere, because most of these conflicts in groups happen because everybody is so super sensitive and personalizes everything. But if we can train people to see this kind of processes more like impersonal processes that show the human condition and not over personalize every single event that happens, and then learn to navigate in this process like endeavor, then it gets much more easier to recognize this kind of the levels and the hierarchies and where the highest wisdom is in every moment. But I do believe you have to transcend ego, good old term, to a certain extent to be able to be awake enough to what's actually happening and where wisdom is located in every moment. And it can change very quickly in a group, no? But only if you are sensitive to where it is, it works.
There's an ambidextrous sensitivity that I think is necessary, right? Because these two agency and communion problems both crop up, right? And we can be too personal in our own status, our own ego, our own reactions, so that we can't access what's going on in the space. But we can also be too sensitive to the group and not have the strength to say no, not really assimilate things into our individuality, right? So we have to get both of those balances working so that we can all get better at moving ahead on both of those.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
one of
exactly.
the classic problems in spirituality is the loss of unique agency in the members of the Sangha to some degree, right? I mean, we've seen that's when it becomes too cultic. Is
Yeah,
it's not serving the individuals. But on the other hand, if it overserves the individuals, then it becomes egoic.
yeah, exactly. And we still have to find out how this can work. This is really work in progress. And I mean, we have a real spiritual practice into subjective non-duality where we train to meet each other in this space, in the non-dual space between the individuals, the egos, beyond the mind. And it's a beautiful practice, and it works. And we haven't figured out how to cultivate so that it's actually capable of holding difficult topics, holding conflict, holding real life, holding conversations about Trump and about Gaza and Israel and Ukraine and Russia. And sometimes I find it almost like I'm almost desperate to see that you can have this kind of spiritual practices and you know it works in a laboratory environment, but it's not strong enough, it's not stable enough to work in real manifest world. And
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
very tricky thing because there's different strategies for that. Like one strategy is, okay, we've got this thing. Is there some other missing element that is required in order to catalyze it? Another strategy is, okay, let's create this personal and interpersonal experience of that which goes beyond our minds. And then let's like slowly move ahead from that into these topics. But
yeah,
then there's another strategy, which is, well, let's come and go into these topics. Let's go to the state and then go all the way into the topic and see if we can find our way back. Right. And then
mm-hmm.
I think for individuals, that's how progress often works, because often you go through breakthrough phases, and then you sort of fall back down into what seems like an exaggerated identification. And then you struggle your way back out. And then what you've done is you've kind of dug a tunnel between these two. But
Yeah,
whether that's the same when you're working with groups and working with general topics, I don't think we know that yet.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, especially that in the groups it gets difficult. It's not only the political topics, it's also the moment when there is a conflict that needs to be addressed, because then people recoil to the personal space, and then the impersonal, the bigger space collapses. And then you find yourself in normal conversations or normal debates or dialogues that are full of ego opinions instead of being able to hold the bigger space. And but there is so much potential there. It's like it's laying right there, and we have to find way, or we want to find ways to stabilize it in a way that it's much more solid, much more robust as a practice. As we want to stabilize our personal awakening so that it's actually stable to live a better life than we lived before. It's the same thing.
The bringing non-duality together with complex post-metaphysical thinking, it doesn't solve all of these things, but it is one example or instance of trying to do this, right? Which is,
Mm-hmm.
can it go into really complicated philosophical nuances? It's sort of like, as can it go into political discussions? And
Mm-hmm.
it may not be that the same thing makes it work in all the different cases, but I'm very impressed by how often I can find it in very strange advanced philosophical discussions in the, let's say, post-metaphysical types of discussions.
Mm.
When I look at things like, let's how to say, there's a risk involved in letting go of absolutes. If I look at 1 + 1 = 2, right, that seems pretty absolute. There's no way no human brain can find that to be wrong. And then you say, yes, but they're not exactly the same, right? Because this one's on this side and this one's on
This
this
one
side.
is a
So
little
they're a
bit
little
different
bit
than this
different.
one.
But they're, even though they're a little bit different, they're as the same as any two things could be.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm saying to myself, okay, it's not absolutely true, but it's maximally true. It's as true as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to let something go. I had to let my assertive confidence in the absolute of the equal sign go. But then I find that there's this exhilarating liberation in switching to the maximum relational rather than the assertion. And then because of that exhilaration, I'm excited and I look more closely and I see that in that ambiguous space, the non-dual thing is shining forth again, the same way it shines forth in any of the in-betweennesses of the world. And so I go, okay, this is possible. It can be found in that space, which is traditionally a space where people don't find it. And if it can be found there, then I'm sure we can find versions of it in all of these other spaces as well.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I agree. It's in the in between and in the not fixed that there is the most freedom. No, it's yeah. Andrew once said in one of the last satsangs something like, if you recognize the nature of the infinite space between thoughts, if you realize the nature of the infinite space between thoughts, that's enlightenment. And that's exactly where you're pointing to. There is a space that is not fixed, cannot even be called absolute because it's not fixed. Infinite is not absolute. There is all kind of things happening in the in between, and in the in between of thoughts, especially where a lot of magic happens.
Yeah. So in different areas, what we might need to do is figure out what the in-betweens are for those areas. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting in, say, political zones or any other place where we have a lot of personal, vital, emotional responses. Because you might have to be able to access the opposite perspective and response in order to create the structure that holds the experience that goes beyond the perspectives. Mm-hmm. Right. So to come back to the Gurdjieffian approach, a lot of that work is taking different partial selves and trying to make them struggle, because in the struggle they touch each other and then they grow more together. So you have a structure then that has more opposites connected together because it takes advantage of the in-between. And then if you have more opposites integrated in yourself, then as a structure, you can bring the transperspectival into yourself better than if you bring it into something that only has one of the possible perspectives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But it's hard, no? I find it extremely hard, like this, even the perspective taking, but what you are describing is even more than perspective taking. It's literally kind of embody a certain perspective or a certain view on things and take it on as if it was yours and then see what is happening.
Well, it is hard. It's hard to access one that isn't your regular one. And then it's extra hard to let them fight in your heart, because that's suffering. They don't, Your heart wants to choose one. It doesn't want to
Yeah,
have them both arguing.
yeah. But let me ask you a question that I really struggle with, like Trump, this big, beautiful bill that will harm so many people. Is it really needed that we can fully embrace the view from which somebody can take such terrible decisions to be able to understand the world? Is it not legitimate to just reject certain things because they just seem evil? It's a serious question that I find endlessly difficult.
I approach it from a couple of different angles. One is that is the Wilbur angle, right? Everything's partially true, but not equally partially true. So there's a scale, and something can be way
Yeah.
down the scale or way up the scale. And you have to be able to, I think, do two things. One is find the parts of it that you can connect to. You don't have to connect to all of it, but there might be aspects of it. Like any political position, any individual, you can find elements that you relate to. And I think that's probably enough. You don't have to relate to the whole way they've put it together. And you have to understand that as clear as it is to you in your feelings, you can never really be sure. There might be something else to it that you don't know. And so I think that holds open that space a little bit. But then in addition to that, the evil question is very interesting because I think it's like you can have very hot water and medium temperature water and very cold water, and at some point it becomes ice, right? And then so its qualities change. I think there's a type of experience in the world, a type of perspective taking that below a certain threshold, the proper way to relate to it is to oppose it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, otherwise it's getting difficult. Yeah. So we are obviously not afraid of integral postmetaphysics.
No, it feels pretty good. When I was a kid, I lived on this island. It had a long, flat beach. And then on the weekends, it would be very foggy and misty out there. And when the tide was out, I would go way out on the beach in the mist. And I'd get to a certain point where if I turned around, I couldn't see the shore. I couldn't see my house anymore. It was just mist in all directions. It was like I was, blurred into the ambiguity of the experience. And I feel like my whole life, I've been delighted by how wonderful the experiences of ambiguity are, right up to the point where they can meet transcendental experience, but they can also become a new kind of certainty. We can build with ambiguities. They're not the opposite of structure. They're a way of making structure. So for me, I'm not afraid of integral postmetaphysics. I think it's delightful. I think it matches the new culture. I think it can hold spirituality, and also it's just fun and enchanting and refreshing to me.
Yeah, and needed. I'm pretty sure it's such an important ingredient for us to move forward into the craziness of the world.
I like that you're pretty sure. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much for having this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.